The United Nations turned 75 at a time of significant global challenges, from COVID-19 to the economic crisis and climate change. Hello, I'm Mike Walter, and this is The Heat. The 75th UN General Assembly is now underway in New York, but due to the ongoing pandemic, this year's meetings are being conducted virtually. Heads of state and presidents, including Chinese President Xi Jinping, will send a pre-recorded video message for next week's UN General Assembly debate. Only U.S. President Donald Trump says he's planning to speak live from the Assembly Hall. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres is calling for a recommitment from member countries to multilateralism.
We just had the COVID-19. It is a virus, a microscopic thing, and it has put us on our knees. Why? Because the world was not able to come together to fight it, because there were divisions. And this is my biggest frustration, that unfortunately the world is too much divided when we would need more than ever unity and solidarity.
For more on the challenges facing the United Nations and the 75th anniversary, let's bring in our panel. Joining us from Beijing is Victor Gao. He's a chair professor at Soochow University. Also with us from Washington, D.C., Anton Fedyashin. He is a professor of history at American University. And from New York, Sarah Cliff is the director of the New York University's Center for International Cooperation. And Sarah, why don't I begin with you? We just heard the UN chief talking to us there. I mean, we're looking at 29 million cases worldwide, close to 1 million deaths. If ever there was a clarion call for cooperation, you would think that would be it. And yet, as he says, the world is divided. Talk to us about that.
Well, we certainly see people around the world, Mike, clamoring for more international cooperation. A new global poll from 2 weeks ago shows that more than 2/3 of people believe that if there had been more international cooperation, they would have seen less COVID cases and less deaths in their own country. So that message from the people of the world is there very strongly. We have seen a few governments try to take that up, typically what we call middle power governments trying to make bridges and to make coalitions together. But we also see great divisions between the great powers, contestation over the World Health Organization, competition over access to vaccines with all the advance orders that we see going in. And this is not only in the health arena, but also in the socio-economic. We see fights over the leadership of the African Development Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, a lack of agreement for the IMF to issue extra liquidity in to, as you said, this unprecedented socio-economic crisis. So what we really need to see on this is more unity of action at this UNGA from countries large and small on 3 key issues: on access to vaccines and on the socio-economic recovery, which are surely the most urgent priorities for the world now, and third, on climate change. And that third may seem a little remote, but in a year in which we've come to face with the forces of nature in a way that has made it so evident to us that we have difficulty in controlling this unless we act together, we also need to see international cooperation and willingness to move forward on climate change.
Yeah, we're going to talk a little bit about that a little bit later in the program. Victor, let's talk about Chinese President Xi Jinping. He's going to be meeting virtually, and he'll also be addressing the gathering. What do you think he's going to say about the pandemic? And do you think he'll also bring up the fact that the U.S. unilateralism and protectionism?
Well, I think President Xi Jinping definitely will emphasize and re-emphasize the importance of international cooperation under the leadership of the United Nations, and he will rededicate China to this international solidarity under the banner of the United Nations, because mankind is now faced with a common enemy, that is the COVID-19 virus, and no country can be left alone under its own wall of protection in dealing with this common threat and menace to mankind as a whole. The panelists just now also mentioned climate change. Climate change doesn't discriminate against one nation versus another, for example. It's again a common enemy of mankind. As such, mankind need common strategy, solidarity, and cooperation in dealing with these menaces. And I think the failure of several governments in living up to the expectation and letting down their own people and mankind as a whole is really the great disappointment of our time. And I think China need to step up. China need to contribute to international solidarity and cooperation. And we want to appeal again to Washington to step up to the daunting task of international cooperation. I think with China and the United States more or less taking similar actions together in fighting against COVID-19, there will be more American lives saved and there will be much less infections among the American people. We pray that this will be the case, and we hope God will save all the Americans. And I'm disappointed and very saddened to see the deterioration of the COVID-19 pandemic in the United States, and I hope America will do a good job, and international cooperation, especially with WHO, will be crucial for the success of U.S. effort in fighting off this COVID-19 virus.
You know, Anton, the UN Secretary General says the charter, quote, brought rules and hope to a world in ruins. Of course, that was 1945, after literally the most destructive war in the history of humankind. And yet here we are in 2020. I think when they started this 75 years ago, they never could have imagined what we're looking at right now, this global pandemic, which, as he said, has brought the world to its knees. Is the UN up to the challenge?
Well, think of the UN as a barometer of international relations, of geopolitics. I think it's a fairly cynical but a very realistic assessment. In other words, the UN is only as effective as the most powerful members that make it up want it to be. If you look at the UN from that point of view, it's really no surprise that it has so much difficulty bringing the great powers of the world together because they simply don't want to be brought together. And this is a trend that's really been developing, going off the rails since the end of the Cold War, since 1991. Unfortunately, what we're seeing today, and Victor just voiced a part of it, is a certain dysfunction in dealing in a coordinated and respectful fashion with the largest health threat since the late 19-teens and the early 1920s. But this is all a manifestation of the great power politics that have come back to sort of rule the day. It's very interesting that this year, of course, when as the UN is celebrating the 75th anniversary, the countries of the world are also, of course, marking the end of the Second World War. Back then, the devastation was so great that it forced countries to compromise. Unfortunately, it doesn't look like we've reached that level yet now.
You know, Sarah, to that point, you know, it's interesting. We looked at these protracted wars. I mean, you look at Yemen, Syria, Libya, and Guterres even says in many ways these conflicts are interlinked, saying Syria is linked to Yemen, to Libya, to the Palestinian issue. Why is it that they are so stuck and can't even make headway there?
Well, again, Mike, this has a lot to do with the divisions among the world's large powers that pan out in those conflicts. So we see not the two blocks framed against each other, of course, that we saw during the Cold War, where the UN actually did successfully play a role in de-escalating some of those tensions and in the end in bringing some of those conflicts to an end, but a much larger number of regional spheres of contestation. So in many of those conflicts, it's been very difficult to make progress, not only because of the situation among the parties who are actually warring on the ground, but because there is interference from outside, which is keeping and fueling those conflicts. So I agree very much with what the last panelist said, that this is a reflection of what we see as the divisions between governments, between countries at the moment.
Anton, how does the UN create conditions to prevent these conflicts, let alone solve them? And as you said, you've got these major powers, and in many cases, these are proxy wars. How do you address that?
You address it through dialogue. You address it through taking the UN Security Council seriously and engaging in dialogue, not in sanctions, not in trying to enforce your opinion, no matter how moral and right it seems to you, but you do it through negotiations. And, you know, this will sound strange, but the Cold War actually gives us a very good example of how two existentially opposed states, the Soviet Union back then and the United States, could disagree on all of the fundamental questions of socio-economic and political organization, and yet respect each other sufficiently, perhaps because they were sufficiently frightened of each other, to actually work through problems through dialogue. And today, the conduct of both Western and non-Western powers often seems to have gone off the rails in that sense. There's a lot of monologues, there's a lot of teaching each other of how things should be, and there's simply not enough dialogue. It's very interesting that in my opinion, the last high point, the last great speech at the UN of all speeches was actually Mikhail Gorbachev's famous address in December of 1988, which he conceived of as the anti-Fulton speech, the repairing of the world from the brilliant speech given by Churchill in 1946, in which described the famous Iron Curtain. And Gorbachev came 40 years later to repair that rift and speak of international security and climate change, by the way, and alleviating international world poverty as truly global issues that needed to involve all countries, regardless of their socio-economic structure and ideology. And that ideal, unfortunately, disappeared with the Soviet Union, and in a very strange sense, it was a loss for everyone.
Interesting. You know, everyone keeps talking about climate change, so let's talk a little bit about that. Sarah, you know, my sister lives out in California. She let me know that she'd been evacuated from her home. She went to her son's home. At 1 a.m., she's evacuated from that home. Now she's in a third location. I wake up in the morning, I see Mobile, Alabama, Pensacola, Florida, underwater. It seems like everyone seems to embrace this idea that climate change is real and it's out there, and yet the President of the United States says it's going to get starting to get cooler. You just watch. Can the UN, can the world body make any headway if they can't convince the U.S. president that this is real?
And I think that you're also right that there is a link between climate change and COVID, in the sense that this is a year in which we have seen our absolute helplessness in the face of a crisis of nature, which it's clear that we have been unable, trying to work alone, to be able to control. So it's remarkable to have COVID-19 followed by the wildfires, and yet still not have an approach at this UNGA which puts international cooperation at the centre. So really this should be the year in which we have seen that there are issues that no individual or family can solve on their own. There are issues that no government, no country can solve on their own. We need to be able to push for international cooperation. And if that can't be done by the more major powers at the moment, it needs to be pushed for by others who need to create a rallying cry that gets popular resonance, that this really is what is needed. And this is what people demand of their governments.
Victor, getting back to what Anton was talking about, it seems though some of these ambassadors, it's the court of public opinion, playing to a domestic audience, lecturing. How do we get away from that where you actually have diplomacy, engagement, what we've been talking about?
Well, I think the situation involving different countries are very, very different. I think there are some very large, major superpower in the world who fail to live up to their responsibility. For example, bailing out of one international organization after another. And in the middle of this pandemic, for one country to bail out of WHO is really a disaster. It actually does not do any positive service to the people of that particular country. And it's a very, very great frustration of international cooperation. Therefore, I think while the people of every country will need to really pick and choose their own leader, the leader so chosen should really size up the situation, look at their own international responsibilities, and truly become a real advocate for the fundamental real interests of their own people, but also for mankind as a whole. We cannot really go into a fractured world where each one will build its own wall and people hide behind the wall. It does not work in the world of connectivity today. Therefore, I think the quality of the leaders of every country does matter. And it matters not only for that particular country, it matters for mankind as a whole. No one can really indulge in the fantasy that I can live in an artificial paradise on earth while all the others suffer in deluge. No, it does not work like that. Virus is a typical example. Climate change is another typical example. We need international cooperation more today than probably any other time in history. This is the megatrend. This is the requirement of the world today. And I hope no country, especially big, powerful countries, will not let down the people and let down mankind.
Sarah, let me ask you, as we commemorate 75 years, what are your hopes for the future?
It would really be that we take the shock of this year as a wake-up call. So I think this is a year in which we've seen people's jobs destroyed, their lives lost, the lives of their relations lost. We've seen whole economies and societies ground to a halt. We have more children out of school now than at any time since World War II. We've seen decades of development reversed. So this has to be a year in which there is a wake-up call for cooperation on what we really do see as the three highest priorities at this year to start work on. In the short term, access to vaccines and medical equipment, cooperating to contain COVID-19, cooperating to combat this menace. Immediately after, and indeed in parallel to that, working on the socio-economic recovery to make sure that all areas of the world can actually recover and build their lives.
We're going to have to leave it there. I want to thank all our guests. This week, Nigerian diplomat Tahani Mohammed Bandi handed over his reign as president of the UN General Assembly to Turkey's ambassador to the United Nations. I had a chance to speak with the ambassador about his accomplishments and how COVID-19 impacted his term.
Well, initially the session started normally, but 3, 4 months, 5 months into the session, everything changed, and it became difficult to continue the work. Certainly not in the way we had anticipated. It has not been easy, but we are grateful that with the support of the membership and the secretariat, we were able to continue to have resolutions and to also have decisions. Obviously, the way to work, because it changed, made it more difficult to have certain negotiations. Even with that, because of the necessity to continue to work, which was something we just agreed had to continue, we were able to get people on board, and people were flexible in understanding the changed circumstances, and we were able to continue to work to the extent that we were able to have about 70 resolutions during the period from the middle of March to date.
You started your term with 3 priorities: poverty eradication, quality education, and inclusion. Obviously, the pandemic probably affected that as well. Talk to us about what you've been able to accomplish and your goals moving forward.
Well, I think the major goals were goals around the SDGs, especially poverty eradication, quality education, inclusion. These were key. The very fact of the matter was that the necessity to work on poverty became even clearer because the pandemic, which was thrust upon all of us as a global community, exposed the urgency of dealing with poverty, because while it affected everyone, every country, it was more a challenge among poorer communities. It is the same thing with education. Education became a big challenge in both poor and rich countries. The poorer section had more challenges continuing to have education provided. And many regions of the world had more difficulty in having online education. So going forward, clearly we could see how important it is to reform education in terms of how to provide it, including, of course, the partnerships that are needed to guarantee access to quality education. Inclusion is key because clearly you want a peaceful world, you want a world in which rights are respected, a world in which there is development. Inclusion is something that is paramount in all aspects of the work of the United Nations. And so this continued in terms of our continued focus on the importance of inclusion, be it of men and women, be it of the young and the old, be it of minorities. And education continues to be important because without it, not much actually can happen. So we continue to talk about the importance of education. We continue to talk about the importance of poverty eradication. And we were able to, through our Alliance for Poverty Eradication, which we launched toward the like 4 weeks ago, to now see a lot of countries realize the importance to continue, both as member states but also other partners, to continue to bring to the attention of the world the need to deal with the issues of poverty.
Certainly, those are challenges. Speaking of challenges, in the 75-year history of the UN, it's always the case world leaders flood into New York for the UN General Assembly. This year, that is not the case because of the global pandemic. So what can we expect?
What we can expect is that we are going to have, under the leadership of Ambassador Boskin of Turkey, who will take over on the 15th of September this year as president now of the 75th session, will have the issues continue to be important. What will change is that we are going to have a hybrid session because not many people can come to the assembly safely. And therefore, some speeches will be read by member states in the room. The bulk majority of them, I suspect, will be take messages from world leaders, and in the hall will be representatives of member states, as many people as the rules of safety will allow. It will be still an exciting session. The same issues will be debated and discussed, partly virtually, partly in person. Participation is key. Beyond the general debate, there will also be the high-level look during which very important issues at the level of summit will also be discussed. And these are also important. And many sessions will be also in a hybrid pattern. This is going to be something that maybe for a few months, as the situation improves, more participation in person will be seen. And this is how we envisage normalcy will return. Let it be clear that the mode of delivery has changed, but the importance of the issues under discussion remain critical, and they are addressed as such.
Of course, one of the critical issues every country is facing is the pandemic, including your home country of Nigeria, which has the third highest number of cases on the continent following South Africa and Egypt. What's the situation on the ground in Nigeria right now, and where do you see areas of concern?
Well, let me say that Nigeria, because I'm not talking now on behalf of Nigeria, Nigeria has just over 1,000 deaths for population of about 200 million. And the number of cases is just over 50,000. And you can see that bad it is to lose any. But the continent as a whole has fared far better than most. And the issue is that in the initial expectation was that Africa would struggle far more than the rest. Certainly this has not been the case, but Africa is struggling with the rest of the world in terms of the number of cases, and they are rising. But the deaths are still bad it is, but not of the magnitude of others. I think the main issue is that we do need to have better grasp of the seriousness of the pandemic. I think public education is key, and there are sections of the population in which there is a bit more of resistance to not only social distancing, but also to the issue of masks. But again, this is not because of politics. I think in some cases, it has to do more with the whole question that people have not seen as many people as perhaps in other countries, but it is a big issue. Governments, because we're dealing with the federal government, have been really focused on public enlightenment concerning the pandemic. On the continent generally, the matter has been seen in terms of the need to have the PPEs, the need to continue to deal with problems, especially in poorer communities, especially in slums around the world. Social distancing becomes even more of a challenge.
Nigerian President Buhari has lent his voice to this global call for a people's vaccine. You know, there are these concerns that Western nations might develop a vaccine, kind of keep it for their country. How important is it that everybody in the world have access to a vaccine once it's available?
I think it's vitally important. And I think predominantly the sentiment I've seen in the resolution spearheaded by Mexico and other resolutions also, both in the Assembly and in the Council, the issue of access to vaccines is understood as critical. I think there is no question that it is known that we cannot get out of this pandemic if any country is having a problem with dealing with it. It is clear that within weeks we'll get back to the problem. I think the United Nations has continued to drum up support for the notion that we must provide vaccines to those who are farthest behind and those who are most vulnerable. And I think this is the sentiment. And there are also protocols or conversations concerning how this might be done in terms of finding means to make available to countries that will have difficulty purchasing, if it's purchasing vaccines as they become available, so that they are available to them. I think both bilateral and multilateral efforts are ongoing. And I personally feel that from what I've seen, I am very confident that if a vaccine that is effective and safe should become available, and from what we hear, there are so many promising developments around the world. I think Africa will have the vaccines just like others. There are also efforts on the continent to develop not only therapeutics, but also vaccines alongside others. For now, those ones we know of are obviously the ones that have been in the public glare for some time at the phase 3 of trials, and several candidates have been announced. I am very confident that the solidarity of human beings around the world will win out against any pushbacks for simply vaccines that deal with nations. I think that's my view.
Ambassador, thank you so much for taking time and talking to us today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you for having me.
And that's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Mike Walter in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.
Hello everybody, I'm Anand Naidu. If you enjoy the thoughtful, engaged discussions you see on The Heat, you may also want to subscribe to our podcast. It's appropriately titled The Heat. Twice a week we take a deep dive on world headlines, talking to experts, journalists and others. It's a fresh, focused and intimate look at the issues that matter most. Whether it's the Hong Kong riots, the latest Middle East conflict or US politics, the Heat podcast gives the clear context needed to understand both what's going on and why. And what's best, we come to you. Whether you're at home or on the go, you can find the Heat podcast just about anywhere podcasts are found. Just search the Heat CGTN. have a listen today and subscribe. Thanks.